Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Walking Through the Book of Exodus. I'm your host, Ruel Barksdale, and today we will be looking at the 21st chapter of the book of Exodus. Now, today, this morning, whenever you're getting this podcast, it's going to be a little bit different because some of the subject matter in the 21st chapter requires that we take a self inspection of our own country. So get your Bible, get your paper, get your pencil, get your iPad, get your technological devices, and join me as we walk through the book of Exodus. The 21st chapter is today. Now, when we look at this chapter, we have to understand that it is a continuation of what we read last week. Last week, we looked at the 20th chapter of the book of Exodus. And in the 20th chapter of the book of Exodus, we saw God giving Moses and the entire nation the Ten Commandments. And the first four of the Ten Commandments dealt with our relationship with God. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Don't make any graven images. Honor the Sabbath. Keep it holy. I am the Lord your God. I brought you out of slavery. And he goes through four commandments. Don't misuse my name. We go through the four commandments of the Ten Commandments that talk about relationship with God. And then the next six commandments talk about the relationships that we should have with each other. And so from the Ten Commandments, now he gets more specificity, and this is what I expect of you. This is how you're going to interact with each other. These are things that you will do. These are things that you will not do. And it amazes me that he starts off this chapter with, I am the Lord your God that brought you out of Egypt. The 20th chapter starts with, I brought you out of slavery. Because that wasn't my promise for you. That wasn't my plan for me. That for you. That wasn't my provision for you. I brought you out of slavery. And so it is illogical, it is immoral for those who have used the Bible to defend slavery to suggest that that was God's plan for anybody. It was not, is not, never was, never will be. And the slavery that was practiced in the books of Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers in the Old Testament had no similarity to what was practiced in the Americas from 1619 and to the 1800s. No similarity. And whoever says that that was God's will is a lie and or just misinformed. Either they're misinformed or have decided to misinform. So we're going to look at that tonight. We're going to look at that today. And so walk with me. Now, let's start with, I want you to understand that slavery was a practice in the Old Testament. If you recall, brother Joseph was sold into slavery, and he was sold into slavery because his brothers hated him. They hated him so much that they first said, well, let's kill him. Reuben says, no, let's throw him in the well. Judah says, well, we might as well get something out of him. Let's send him into slavery. So go with me to the 37th chapter of the book of Genesis, and we will start with verse 12. Now, you got to understand that the reason why they sold him into slavery is because he was different. He wasn't like the rest of his brothers. He had special gifts, special talents. And he had this coat of many colors that his father had given him. And they hated him. They despised him, were willing to kill him because of his differences. I don't know what it is about humankind, but something about humankind seems to cause problems when people focus on differences. But the fact of the matter is that each of us has a unique fingerprint. Nobody living, nobody born, nobody yet to be born will have your fingerprint. God created us to be different. You were born a unique specimen. Don't die a copy. And so there's so much pressure on us to conform, to assimilate, to fit in, that we lose the wonder of our uniqueness. And sometimes it's our uniqueness that makes people hate us, makes people despise us, because we're not like everybody else. When you'll never see eagles flocking. No, they fly solo. Pigeons will flock. Huh? Birds of that sit on telephone wires will flock, but you're not going to see an eagle flocking with other eagles. Be an eagle. God made you an original. Don't die a copy. And so his brothers hated him, and when they see him coming, they start planning. Ooh, we gonna get him. We gonna kill him. See what becomes of his dream. Let's start with the 37th chapter of Genesis, verse 12. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, what are you looking for?" He replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing the flocks?" "They have moved on from here," the man answered. I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went out after his brothers and found them near Dothan, but they saw him in the distance. And before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. They hated him that much. They saw his coat of many colors. They heard his dreams. They heard his talking to them as if he was special. And he was. And they said, we got to get him. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan, but they saw him in the distance. And before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of those cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the desert, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So Joseph came to his brothers. They stripped him of his robe, the richly ornamented robe that his father had given him, the robe that he was wearing. And they took him and threw him into the cistern. They threw him into the well. Now the cistern was empty. There was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices and balm and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. He was sold into slavery by his brothers. Why was he sold into slavery? Because he was different. When you look at the slave trade that brought people from 1619 to this continent, why were they sold into slavery? Because they were different. And people hated them to the point where they took their humanity, they stripped them of their humanhood, and made them build a country on the sweat and the blood of their backs, sold them, captured them, stole them, brought them from one continent to another, and created a form of slavery that the world has not seen. We will see tonight that the slavery that was perpetrated in the United States of America had no similarity to the slavery that was perpetrated in the books of Genesis and Exodus. It wasn't the same. The slaves in the book of Exodus had rights. They had humanity, and they were not to be harmed. And if they were harmed, there were punishments. There were no punishments for harming slaves. If you killed them, you killed them. If you beat them, you beat them. If you raped them, you raped them. And so anybody that tells you that was a God-ordained institution is a liar. They are either misinformed or they are misinforming. All right, so let's see what we have. Now, before we get to the book of Exodus, chapter 21, I want to share with you a reading from a book that I have been studying, Cast, The Origins of Our Discontents by Isabel Wilkerson. If you have not read that book, please get that book. It will inform you, it will educate you, it will allow you to know where we got to, how we got to where we are in this country, the origins of our discontent. She does a historical perspective of how this color coded system in the United States came to be, and why we differentiate between black and white and red and yellow and brown, and how this social construct, it's not a physical construct, a social construct of race began to be prevalent and began to be part of the fabric of this country. And I read from page 44, slavery in this land was not merely an unfortunate thing that happened to black people. It was an American innovation, an American institution created by and for the benefit of the elites of the dominant caste and enforced by poorer members of the dominant caste who tied their lot to the caste system rather than to their consciousness. It made lords of everyone in the dominant caste, as law and custom stated, that submission is required of the slave, not to the will of the master only, but to the will of all other white persons. It was not merely a torn thread in an otherwise perfect cloth, wrote the sociologist Steven Steinberg. It would be closer to say that slavery provided the fabric out of which the cloth was made. American slavery, which lasted from 1619 to 1865, was not the slavery of ancient Greece or the illicit sex slavery of today. The abhorrent slavery of today is unreservedly illegal, and any current day victim who escapes to a world that recognizes her freedom and will work to punish her enslaver. American slavery, by contrast, was legal and sanctioned by the state and a web of enforcers. And any victim who managed to escaped to a world that not only did not recognize her freedom, but would return her to her captors for further unspeakable horrors as retribution. In American slavery, the victims, not the enslavers, were punished, subject to whatever atrocities the enslaver could devise as a lesson to others. Before there was a United States of America, there was enslavement. Theirs was a living death passed down for 12 generations. The slave is doomed to toil that others may reap the fruits, is how a letter writer identifying himself as Judge Ruffin testified to what he saw in the Deep South. The slave is entirely subject to the will of the master. And that was the atrocity. That was the horrific situation that was perpetrated for 12 generations in the country of the United States of America. I want you to, as we read through the 21st chapter of the book of Exodus, I want you to compare and contrast the law that Moses laid down relative to not only slaves, but we'll also look at how we're supposed to treat our parents. And we'll look at absolute liability for our animals that hurt other people. The 21st chapter of Exodus, then, is a chapter that allows the Israelites to have laws and precepts and a way of living that would prepare them to ultimately live in the promised land. They had to learn the precepts and the concepts of God. And the precepts and the concepts of God honor the humanity of all people, honor the dignity of humankind. And I want you to compare and contrast that to what we've seen in the Americas. And anybody that tells you that slavery in the Americas was a sanctioned institution of God either is misinformed or is misinforming. All right, so let's read the 21st chapter of the book of Exodus, following the Ten Commandments. It reads this way: These are the laws you are to set before them. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the seventh year he shall go free, without paying anything. If he comes alone, he is to go free alone. But if he has a wife when he comes, she is to go with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and only the man shall go free. But if the servant declares, I love my master and my wife and my children, and do not want to go free, then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door of the doorpost, and pierce his ear with an awl, AWL. Then he will be his servant for life. How many of you know that mothers and fathers and children were separated without thought, without mercy, without care for humanity in the institution of slavery perpetrated in the United States of America? That was not the case in the Old Testament. This evil institution that we witnessed in America was different, and it was not of God. If a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to go free as men servants do. If she does not please the master who has selected her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to foreigners because he has broken faith with her. If he selects her for his son, he must grant her the rights of a daughter. If he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, or marital rights. If he does not provide her with these three things, she is to go free without any payment or money. And now we talk about personal injuries. Anyone who strikes a man and kills him shall surely be put to death. In other words, I don't expect you to be fighting each other. I don't expect you to put your hands on anybody. I don't expect there to be physical harm in the family, in the nation. Don't put your hands on anybody. However, if anyone who strikes a man and kills him shall surely be put to death. However, if he does not do it intentionally, but God lets it happen, he is to flee to a place I will designate. And that's where we get the city of refuge. You could flee to the city of refuge, lay on the altar, and you were safe. But if a man schemes and kills another man deliberately, take him away from my altar and put him to death. Anyone who attacks his father or his mother, hear me, anyone who attacks his father or his mother must be put to death. Anyone who kidnaps another, and see, part of the slave trade in the Americas was people, now some were sold, but many would go to the continent of Africa and kidnap natives of the continent of Africa, bring them over to this country, brutalize them, steal their humanity. And again, the 21st chapter of Exodus tells you this is not of God. Anyone who kidnaps another and either sells him or still has him when he is caught must be put. You kidnap somebody, we catch you, and he's stealing your property. Oh, you dying. Must be put to death. If men quarrel and one hits the other with a stone or with his fist, and he does not die but is confined to bed, the one who struck the blow will not be held responsible if the other gets up and walks around outside with his staff. However, he must pay the injured man for the loss of his time and see that he is completely healed. Violence was not condoned. And in certain situations, your violence could cause you to lose your life. If a man beats his male or female slave with a rod and the slave dies as a direct result, he must be punished. but he is not to be punished if the slave gives up after a day or two, since the slave is his property. If men who are fighting hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there is no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands, and the court allows. This was a patriarchal society, and the court allows. But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. If a man hits a manservant or maidservant in the eye and destroys it, he must let the servant go free to compensate for that eye. And if he knocks out the tooth of a manservant or maidservant, he must let that servant go free to compensate. Violence and it was not to be. And when you look at the violence that was perpetuated on Africans that were not slaves, that free people that were brought to this continent and enslaved, it was a different kind of humanity. It was a different type of brutality. It was a different type of atrocity that was perpetrated on people that is nowhere in the Bible sanctioned. If a bull gores a man or a woman to death, the bull must be stoned to death, and its meat must not be eaten. But the owner of the bull will not be held responsible. If, however, the bull has had the habit of goring, and the owner has been warned but has not kept it pinned up, and it kills a man or a woman, the bull must be stoned, and the owner also must be put to death. That's where we get the concept of absolute liability. However, if payment is demanded of him, he may redeem his life by paying whatever is demanded. This law also applies if the bull gores a son or a daughter. If the bull gores a male or female slave, the owner must pay 30 shekels of silver to the master of the slave, and the bull must be stoned. If a man uncovers a pit or digs one and fails to cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit must pay for the loss. He must pay its owner, and the dead animal will be his. If a man's bull injures the bull of another and it dies, they are to sell the live one and divide both the money and the dead animal equally. However, if it was known that the bull had the habit of goring, yet the owner did not keep it pinned up, the owner must pay animal for animal, and the dead animal will be his. For the next 3 chapters after chapter 20, we look at specificity of law, and God is laying down precept upon precept about how you should relate to each other. I've got to get you together before you get to the promised land. I don't want you to act like the heathens. I don't want you to be a wild people. I don't want you to be a violent people with each other. I don't want you putting your hands on each other. I want you to honor the sanctity of life. And that's what we did not see with the American institution of slavery. There was no sanctity of life, and it was not God ordained. Listen, there's so much for us to learn in the next chapters of the book of Genesis. The book of Exodus. So please join me as we walk through the remaining chapters of this phenomenal book. Listen, tell a friend, tell an enemy about our walk through the book of Exodus, and maybe by the time the next chapter is over, you and your enemy will be friends. I love you. God loves you more. See you in chapter 22. Bye-bye.